Hi, I'm Dr. Donna Lane.
And I'm Dr. David Lane.
We're going to talk today about Veterans Day, and we're going to talk about some issues that some veterans face when they return home after deployment. So I'm going to ask you some questions, David, and ask you to just speak to us about the things that you have learned and that you know about veterans issues. First, I guess since November the 11th is coming up real soon, I thought maybe you would want to talk about what's important about Veterans Day and why do we celebrate it?
Yeah, it's a very important holiday, particularly for those people who have served. A lot of the public confuses Veterans Day and Memorial Day, Flag Day, etc. Veterans Day is to celebrate veterans. Memorial Day is to remember those who paid the ultimate price, people who died in service or people who were veterans who have died. But Veterans Day is to celebrate living veterans and active duty personnel, and so that's an important distinction to me. And my personal opinion is we owe veterans a tremendous debt. They at some point in their life agreed to sign on a piece of paper that I will stand up for the rest of the country. I will stand and represent the United States at the cost of my life, potentially. And they know that when they're signing on the dotted line. They know that when they are taking the pledge, when they are committing to their service. And with all volunteer military nowadays, that's only about 1% of the population who does that. Back in the draft days, up through Vietnam, when people were drafted in military service, it was a little bit different. Larger percentage of the public served in the military, but now with all volunteer military, it's only about 1% that serves. And to my way of thinking, the other 99 of us owe that 1% a great debt. And November 11th is extremely important to celebrate the folks and the sacrifices they've made, even if they didn't serve at combat tours, even if they weren't in a combat role in the military, they still are served an extremely important role. They sacrifice tremendously. Those jobs are hard. They work under a great deal of pressure. They have terrible circumstances to live under frequently. You think about your worst living arrangement probably when you were first just getting out on your own and you had nothing really, were just starting out, got that first job or just finished college or just went to work right out of high school or something, and you were struggling and struggling. They live in worse conditions than that. Even the best duty lives in worse conditions than that. They live in a barracks with a bunch of other people frequently, shared bathrooms, and then they work 12, 16 hours a day at their jobs, whatever their job is. And that's the folks who play support roles, which is really about 90 or 95% of veterans. Their role in the military was some support role, because it needs all kind of people to run the military, everything from cooks and drivers to weapons experts to engineers to all kind of things that don't ever have contact with the enemy potentially, all the way over to the armed version, the tip of the spear, so to speak, who live in some really hideous conditions. So the tip of the spear gets the worst of it, but everybody who has been in the military, who's been deployed, even in non-combat roles, lived in some pretty tough conditions sometimes, and we owe them a great deal. They're willing to make that kind of sacrifice and work as hard as they work and train as hard as they train and endure the difficulties that they have to endure. It's kind of unimaginable to the vast majority of folks what they have to deal with on a day-to-day basis and the sacrifices they make just in a general way of life, much less in a combat role. So I think we owe them tremendous debt, that 1% that's willing to stand on the wall, sign that blank check, and say up to the cost of my life if necessary. Mm-hmm. So that's what it means to me.
Well, speaking of cost, what are some of the issues that some veterans might face after they have deployed or when they return from deployment?
Right. Well, Generally, when people think about deployments, they think about combat deployments. And we've been in the war on terror since after 9/11. And so it's been about 20 years now that we've been conducting this war on terror with troops in Afghanistan and Iraq, and lots and lots of combat. And in those things, like in those situations, like in Vietnam as well, there really weren't any front lines. You could be in a support role, but with the war on terror, is one of the hallmark of the war on terror is improvised explosive devices. So you could just be a company clerk driving from point A to point B and get hit by an IED. So there's always a threat every time somebody is in a combat theater like Afghanistan, where I know we're out of Afghanistan now, but for the last 20 years, and Iraq for the last 20 years, the potential existed to be under fire and come under fire. So even if they weren't, they had to live with that heightened anxiety, because if I am alert, if I'm hyper alert, then that aids my survival. So when folks come home from Afghanistan and Iraq, they they don't just come home and get off the plane and whoo, glad that's over with and relaxed, and now I'm back to the old David that walked out the door. No, they, if nothing else, need some time to decompress. They need to wind down. They need to get their brain and central nervous system off of high alert. And you don't just flip a switch and make that happen. That happens through a decompression period. Even somebody who was in a non-hazardous duty, my brother is still active duty Army, and he was deployed to Kosovo, which is a non-combat tour. It's a peacekeeping mission. They've not had any armed conflict in Kosovo in years and years, but the UN still keeps troops there, and he was part of coalition forces deployed to Kosovo. And he came home after, didn't serve in a combat role, but came home and needed it was probably around 90 days that he needed to kind of decompress and wind down just from the grind of what he had been doing. He'd been living in tough conditions, in barracks, eating. I can't use the language that he used to describe the food that they had to eat 3 meals a day, and the stress of working. He literally worked essentially 7 days a week, 12-hour shifts, and sometimes 14 to 16 hours. So you've been going at that pace for a solid year. You come home, you need some time to decompress. And so folks, that sets the stage for a multitude of difficulties that veterans can suffer. If they were in a combat role, of course, they potentially have the symptoms of trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, acute stress disorder, all those kind of things. Or a lot of them will say, I don't have a disorder. I do have PTS. I do have post-traumatic stress, but I don't have a disorder. So you don't necessarily think disorder. You just think the stress that they've endured has had a huge impact on them. So you've got that one end of the continuum over to the other end of the continuum of just needing time just to be calm and get my brain out of that 12 to 16 hour, 7-day-a-week driving force to get everything done that I need to get done, my piece of the mission, and come back and settle back into being around my family, living, having decent food, living, sleeping in my bed again. Takes me a minute to wind down. So from one end of the continuum is PTS, post-traumatic symptomatology, to the other end of the continuum of I have potentially family issues, because there's 3 phases to a deployment cycle for that families struggle through. The first phase is when they get the orders. They know they're going to be deployed in 6 months or a year from now, and then the family has to start gearing up for the deployment, both mentally, and they literally have to do lots of stuff, because the person who stays home has to assume 100% of responsibility virtually of running the household, of taking care of the kids if there's kids, of paying all the bills, of doing everything that 2 people shared. They've now got to do it. It falls on the shoulders of one person, the person that stays home. Then that build up and the slow disconnect, because if I'm going to be gone for a year, I need to start putting some space here so it doesn't hurt so bad when I got to get on the plane. It's going to hurt anyway. It's going to hurt real bad anyway. when I get on that plane and have to part from my family, it's going to hurt, but a natural unconscious process is we begin to distance. Second phase is the actual deployment itself, where I'm in the veterans in theater, and they can come now wonder. And my brother, who's he's been home about a year now from his deployment. He got home March of 20, so a little about 18 months. He said that he didn't know which was worse, being somewhere where you in the old days wrote letters, hand letters, and not being able to see that person, to now you can FaceTime and you can have contact with them every day, but FaceTime is just not the same. He said in some respects it makes you want to be there worse. And so he said he didn't know which was worse, having no contact or being able to have daily contact, but not actually being able to be there and being home and constantly thinking about home because of that reminder every day with FaceTime. Because when you're in theater and don't have any contact, you can kind of put it in the back of your mind. And so his description was he didn't know which one was worse. But anyway, so those problems with family all the way over to the problems of post-traumatic stress. Now, to add a caveat, about literally it's only about 5% of the military who have active combat roles. And those are the folks that are most susceptible to post-traumatic stress. And the other folks are susceptible, however, the other 95% are susceptible to the family struggles, the issues of loneliness and maybe depression that grows out of that, and anxiety that grows out of that. Anxiety and depression also may go with post-traumatic stress. And sometimes, in a blessedly very small percentage of folks, that may lead to poor coping mechanisms like alcohol or drugs. Also, if there's any kind of injury, a wound or some kind of accident or injury, they may be on pain medication, which may lead to some other bad consequences. So there are multiple issues that veterans potentially face. But the truth is, and again, the caveat is, fully 95% of people who serve in the military never have any problems at all. They never struggle. They come right home. They readjust pretty quickly to life in the civilian world after they're discharged or after they come home from deployment, and they don't struggle. They don't have any problems. They don't have post-traumatic stress. They don't have huge struggles in their family, and blessedly, that's the vast majority of them. What you hear about in the news is the small percentage who do develop those problems with addiction, who do develop post-traumatic stress disorder, and the suicide rate is tied closely to that. We know the suicide rate is extremely high, so which is another reason to think at Veterans Day about how can I support veterans, how can I support active duty military personnel in my day-to-day life. Some of you have family members that are in the military or did serve. They're now veterans. But some of you, I had somebody say the other day, well, gosh, I really don't know a soul that's a veteran. And that's because, like I said earlier, it's only 1% of the population nowadays who ever serves. So those are kind of the questions that I think about as we get around Veterans Day. How can I help a veteran? How can I have an impact on some active duty military personnel's life? And how can I play a supportive role? Because they do deserve our support. The other 99% of us who benefit from their labors, we do need to respect and support them.
How can those of us who have not ever served in the military and don't really know much about it from personal experience, how can we best talk to veterans or approach veterans to offer that support? What kinds of things would you suggest?
Well, let me start with a don't do.
Okay.
I don't know how many people, how many veterans have told me that they get home from deployment or they get discharged from the military and they go back home and they're around their family and their friends. And the first thing out of a lot of people's mouth is, so you're out of the service now. Where all were you? That might be the first thing. Well, I got sent to blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. Second question, did you kill anybody? Please don't do that. That is a huge no-no, because you are asking that person to relive potentially the worst moment of the worst day of the entirety of their life. What would it be like for you? Because we've all had a worst moment, worst day of our lives. What would it be like for you if everybody you met said, let me poke at that worst moment, that worst day you ever had in your life? What would that be like for you? So I'll start with a don't do this, or don't do that. So one of the best things that I ever heard was a former student of mine. She's now a professor at a university. She earned both her master's and her PhD in the program, and I served on her dissertation chair. Just a wonderful, wonderful human being. But her dad had served in the Marine Corps. He was a combat veteran from Vietnam in the Marine Corps, and he just never talked about his service. And she read, I'm co-author of a book called Counseling Veterans with Dr. Keith Myers. She read that book, and she said that she went, and one Sunday, she was at her mom and daddy's house, and she went in her living room. Her dad was sitting in a recliner, and she said, "You've never talked about your service. Tell me about your service." And he started talking, and he opened up, and she said they really connected. And he said, "Nobody's ever asked me about my service, and nobody's ever asked me. They all wanted to know, did I kill anybody, and how many people did I kill, and that. But nobody's just asked me about my service." So I think that's a really, really good thing to do with a veteran is thank them for being willing to do what you weren't willing to do, or decided not to do. Might have been willing, but just decided not to for one reason or the other. And tell me about your service. And generally that's very non-threatening. It's in fact frequently welcomes. A lot of them will poo-poo it and say, "Oh, it wasn't a big deal. I didn't really do much. I was a mechanic in a on tanks." And that sounds really, really interesting. I've never even been up close to a tank. Tell me about what it's like working on those big old things. And you said, where all did you go, et cetera. Just be curious about that kind of stuff, about their service, because the vast majority are extremely proud of their service and are extremely proud of what they've done, because it's really 1% of the population. If you do something only 1% of the population has done, you're breathing pretty rarefied air. So most of them are very willing to talk about the service. Just kind of stay away from the tough stuff, to stay away from the tough times. Number one, it ain't none of your dadgum business. But number two, it's really, really hard on them if they did have some terrifying, traumatic stuff. On the other hand, if they begin to open up to you, they will frequently eventually wind up talking about the tough stuff that they experienced, which is very, very good. It's extraordinarily good for somebody to be able to tell their story and feel like somebody's going to listen to them and somebody cares. So that's what I would suggest to the average person about how to talk with a veteran, how to approach. Just ask them about your service.
And if they do open up and start sharing, and they talk about some of the serious and painful experiences they've had, be a good listener.
Just listen.
Just listen. Don't talk about something you've experienced. Bring it over to you. Don't poke to ask more questions. Just let them share and demonstrate that you're interested by your continued engagement and responsiveness to them, to what they're saying.
And stay away from being judgmental. I mean, even in your facial expressions, like, "Oh my God," or "No, not that." Just be there for them. Just sit still and listen, and let them tell the story. as they want to tell the story. Because it may be nothing. They may just, well, I served in the Army, and I was in Germany for 2 years and really enjoyed that. Got to do a lot of skiing in the Alps and all of that. Learned how to ski over there, and I just worked on Humvees and tanks and stuff, and essentially enjoyed myself. Was at Fort Dix, New Jersey for a while. They sent me down to Texas, but other than that, then that may be their story. But others who really had played a combat role, they'll need some time, if ever, to warm up and begin to unfold. And they'll be okay with them not giving you a lot of specifics. But the mission that you would have is to let them know that you care and to let them know that you are willing to listen.
And appreciate what they've done.
And for those counselors out there, if there's any counselors or psychotherapists who are interested in working with veterans, what you need to do, two things you need to do. One is you need to learn the language, because they got a whole nother language that you need to learn, all the military terms. And if you ask them about their service, they'll start speaking that language. They'll start talking about that language. Or if they're still active duty and you ask them about their service, they'll start talking that language. And the second thing, and I'm laughing because profanity is a big part of their language. So when they switch back to being a Marine, in their brain, you better be okay with profanity. They switch back to being, paratrooper from the, 82nd Airborne, from Army. They're gonna start speaking that language. So you got to be comfortable, got to be okay with that. You don't have to join in it. Not what I'm saying, but speak their language, i.e., military terminology, so you understand what they're talking about. Do yourself a favor, go learn that language. And the second thing is you got to be comfortable with profanity and sort of a bit of a twisted sense of humor, which is just hysterical. I mean, they really are a lot of incredibly funny stories that they can tell. But you got to be willing to be okay with that if you're going to work with any veteran population. But that's an aside. This is a general celebrate veterans, talk about veterans, understand their issues a little more segment, and celebrate this November the 11th, because us 99% owe that 1% a tremendous debt.
Can you talk a little bit about moral injury? Because I imagine that most people don't even know what moral injury is, but I know that that's something that veterans can struggle with, and in particular in modern era, it seems to be a lot more prevalent. So can you speak about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Moral injury looks a lot like PTSD, very similar symptoms, but they have different origins. PTSD has its origin in fear, in terror, and one of the diagnostic criterion for a disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, is that a person has witnessed a death or believed that they were about to die or were in grave imminent harm. The hallmark of moral injury is shame, guilt, and betrayal. So they have different etiologies, but very close symptoms. They look very similar on the surface, but then when you dig down, you find shame, guilt, betrayal. Oh, this is moral injury. You find terror, fear. You're talking about PTSD. Moral injury happens when somebody is called to do something, and this happens occasionally in the military. They're called to do something by a legitimate higher authority that breaches their moral code, that breaches the person's moral code, and it's legitimate order from a higher authority, but it's in breach of a moral code and has high risk associated with, high stakes associated with it. One of the most susceptible professions in the military to moral injury are the drone pilots, and that's one of the reasons that it's more prevalent in this era than it has been in previous eras. But drone pilots, they live a schism. There's a tearing that they experience. because they're stationed. There's a big drone center out near Las Vegas, and they're stationed near Las Vegas, kind of the party capital of the world. So they go into work at 5 in the morning, 4 in the morning, 6 in the morning, whenever their shift starts. And they go in what looks like a shipping container. And it's a little building. They go in and they are at computer screens flying a drone in Iraq, in Afghanistan. I keep saying Afghanistan. I'm aware that we're out of Afghanistan. I haven't forgotten that. But these folks, that's very recent, and these folks are still decompressing from those experiences. And they'll be sitting in there as if they're playing a video game. It has, to some extent, the feel of playing a video game. And they'll be ordered to strike a building, or they'll be ordered to strike a village. And as they release their missiles, as they release their ordnance, they'll see kids run out the back door of the building with a soccer ball, or they'll see a woman come out to hang up a basket of laundry on a clothesline out back. And then they get off their shift at 6 o'clock, or and go out the door and go party with their friends that evening as if nothing happened. But they know that this was not a video game. They know that this was real. They know that they just potentially killed innocent women and children. And what does that do to a person's moral compass? What does that do to how a person views him or herself when they look in the mirror and see, I followed that order. I did that. What does that say about me? And sometimes that just breaks something inside of a person. It has a spiritual component, because many people in those situations kind of feel betrayed, not just by the hires in the military, but they'll feel betrayed by God. How could God let this happen? And so one of the ways that you deal with moral injury is address the spiritual component, that schism, that shearing, and tearing that a person feels in their morality, their moral compass, their soul. So that's kind of what moral injury is. Can happen in a lot of situations too. A lot of people will feel betrayed. Ground troops will feel betrayed because they know that the intelligence is bad, meaning the information they have on this particular situation is bad, but their company commander or the division commander orders them to go in anyway, and they get a bunch of people killed. When they knew what they were walking into, they tried to talk them out of it, and they made them do it anyway. And that feels like a betrayal. And now they feel horribly guilty. I should have done something. I could have done something if I'd stood up, if I defied that. But then, your career dies, your life ends metaphorically if you do that. But so it's extremely difficult to do that. But it can happen in a number of situations. But again, looks a lot symptomatology-wise like PTSD, but has different origins and plays out a bit differently. So I hope that made sense.
Yeah, made sense to me.
Cool.
Any last thoughts that you want to share about Veterans Day or about supporting veterans?
Remember, it's a day to celebrate veterans and active duty personnel. Memorial Days for those who died in service, or veterans who've gone on home now to be with the Lord. And let's celebrate the veterans. Let's make them feel appreciated. Let's help them understand that the 99% really needs them and really appreciates what they do, and thank them for making the sacrifices that they make and being able to and willing to do the things that they do for the betterment of this country and the betterment of tons of people that they'll never face, but they've done a tremendous service for.
All right. Well, thank you. And thank you for spending the last 30 minutes with us. I hope that it was informative for you. And I hope that you do make sure that when you see a veteran that you thank them for their service. We will talk to you soon with more conversations. Bye.